Okay, let's dive in. The air has been pretty thick in Washington recently, hasn't it?
Especially around that House Oversight hearing.
Exactly. The one where we saw blue state governors really put squarely in the hot seat.
Called to testify about these sanctuary immigration policies, as they're often labeled.
Yeah, and it just highlights this incredibly tense fault line running through U.S. immigration policy. You know, the clash between federal enforcement goals and how individual states or cities choose to handle things on the ground.
That June 12th hearing was definitely a flashpoint. It really brought that tension right to the forefront. You had Governors Tim Walz from Minnesota, J.B. Pritzker from Illinois, and Kathy Hochul from New York, all there presenting their case.
Defending their approaches against some pretty sharp accusations, right?
Absolutely. From the committee majority, yes.
And that's precisely what this deep dive is all about today. We're going to unpack that complex, often conflicting landscape of U.S. immigration policy.
Focusing right on that core tension. Federal authority versus state autonomy.
And we're using the sources you've shared with us.
Right, we're pulling insights from quite a range of material here.
Like what?
Well, news coverage of that hearing itself from CBS News, Politico.
Yeah.
Then there's legal analysis from WASDN PLLC and the National Immigrant Justice Center, the NIJC.
Okay.
We've also got historical context from Timelines, Council on Foreign Relations, U.S. Immigration, and Global Energy Timeline, plus perspectives from places like Reddit discussions and reporting from NPR on public opinion and, the internal political debates.
So our mission here is really to try and cut through some of the noise around this issue.
Get to the core arguments.
Yeah, understand the legal framework, the constitutional stuff that underpins this whole state-federal dynamic, look at the political forces at play, and explore the real-world impacts that are discussed in these sources.
The goal is to give you a clear, well-rounded picture of what's happening and why.
Without getting bogged down in just the political rhetoric, hopefully.
And what's really critical to grasp from the start, I think, is that this conflict, this tension, it isn't new. Not at all.
But it feels like it's entering a particularly intense phase now.
Highlighted by events exactly like this hearing.
Okay, so let's start right there then. The hearing. Chairman Comer, he set a pretty clear tone right from the beginning.
He did.
Claiming state and local officials are, quote, actively undermining federal immigration enforcement. He argued legislative action is urgently needed to stop this subversion and stop the rule of law.
Strong words.
Very. And he made this really strong assertion, saying that for today's Democrat Party, unlimited illegal immigration isn't a failure of policy, it is the policy.
And that framing, it aligns directly with the perspective reflected in some of the sources and certainly the messaging around that hearing.
That's so.
Well, it views state policies that limit cooperation with federal immigration agents, like ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It views those as states actively choosing not to enforce federal law.
Which critics then argue hinders border security, hinders enforcement efforts overall.
Exactly. And we saw that viewpoint reinforced in that GOP video released just before the hearing.
Well, yes. Accusing the governors of shielding undocumented immigrants and contributing to chaos.
That was the language used.
And that messaging, it clearly resonates with broader political goals, like former President Trump's stated intention to target localities that don't fully cooperate with his immigration agenda.
But the governors, they came prepared to push back hard on that narrative.
Offering a different perspective.
Rooted in their interpretation of state responsibilities, constitutional principles. Governor Walz of Minnesota, for instance, he pointed out Minnesota isn't even technically defined as a sanctuary state.
Interesting.
His core defense, as detailed in the sources, was that enforcing federal immigration law, quote, is not the role of local and state governments.
So whose role is it then, according to him?
The federal government's. He argued the primary responsibility for securing the border lies squarely with the federal government.
It was interesting, too, how Republicans on the panel brought up his handling of the 2020 protests, the National Guard deployment then.
Yeah, seemingly trying to draw a parallel, maybe. Or find justification for more recent federal deployments, like the controversial one in Los Angeles.
Right. And Governor Hochul of New York, she talked about managing an, quote, unprecedented immigrant influx.
And she directly attributed it to what she called a broken border.
But she was careful to clarify New York's position, wasn't she?
Very careful. She stressed that state laws do require cooperation with ICE, but specifically in criminal cases, where individuals have committed serious offenses.
Okay, so there is cooperation.
In criminal matters, yes. But, she emphasized, state values dictate treating law-abiding people with dignity. And she drew a key distinction. She said, what we don't do is civil immigration enforcement. That's the federal government's job.
Got it. Civil versus criminal.
And she reiterated support for secure borders, but also for comprehensive federal reform.
Governor Pritzker from Illinois seemed to echo that line.
He did, saying Illinois follows the law, expects the federal government to do the same. He explicitly blamed a lack of federal and border state cooperation for making the challenges worse for states like Illinois.
But he was pretty firm on one point.
Very. Quote, violent criminals have no place on our streets, and if they are undocumented, I want them out of Illinois and out of our country.
Yet at the same time, he strongly criticized federal tactics, saying it's wrong to deploy the National Guard and active duty Marines into an American city over the objection of local law enforcement just to inflame a situation and create a crisis.
Which clearly links back to that recent LA deployment mentioned in the sources, framing it as a significant federal overreach.
In the hearing itself, it wasn't exactly calm exchanges, was it?
No, definitely marked by some heated moments. Representative Elise Stefanik really pressed Governor Hochul hard,
linking specific crimes in New York to what Stefanik called Hochul's failed policies.
Right, and Hochul defended her state's cooperation in criminal cases, suggesting Stefanik was maybe prioritizing, quote, going after the viral moment. Similarly, Representative Langworthy seemed to imply a connection between New York's policies and the tragic death of Laken Riley.
Again, prompting Hochul to stress cooperation, but specifically in criminal matters.
Especially criminal ones, yes.
And this hearing, as the sources point out, it wasn't a one-off.
No, it followed a similar session back in March that featured Democratic mayors,
suggesting a sustained effort by the House majority to spotlight these local and state policies and critique them.
And digging deeper, these clashes at the hearing, they really bring us to the heart of the legal and constitutional foundation underpinning this whole debate.
Which is?
The concept known as the anti-commandeering principle.
Okay, let's unpack that. What exactly does anti-commandeering mean here? How does it apply to immigration enforcement?
Well, at its core, it basically means the federal government generally cannot compel states or local governments to enforce federal law. They can't force them to use state resources to assist federal functions.
So the feds can't just order state police to act as immigration agents?
Broadly speaking, no. The National Immigrant Justice Center source, for instance, explicitly states the federal government cannot force states or localities to help enforce federal immigration laws.
Where does this principle come from?
It's derived from the structure of the Constitution, and specifically the 10th Amendment, which reserves powers not delegated to the federal government to the states.
Okay, but wait, what about the Supremacy Clause? I always hear about that. Doesn't that say federal law is supreme?
It does.
So if federal immigration law says certain people can be deported, how can state policy not contradict that?
That's a really crucial distinction. And it's one highlighted in discussions like those found on Reddit, actually.
Okay.
The Supremacy Clause absolutely means state laws cannot contradict or obstruct federal law. So, for example, a state couldn't pass a law saying, undocumented status is suddenly legal within its borders.
Because that would directly contradict federal law.
Exactly. However, refusing to assist federal enforcement, meaning choosing not to use your state police officers or your state jails to help ICE locate or detain individuals solely on immigration grounds, that's legally different from actively obstructing federal law.
I see. So states still have power to set their own law enforcement priorities.
That's the argument. And we've seen this tested in court repeatedly.
Yeah. Right.
Federal courts have, by and large, upheld states' constitutional right to set their own local law enforcement policies.
So judges have sided with the states on this.
In many key cases, yes. The NIJC source points out how federal judges blocked attempts by the Trump administration to penalize or strip funding from jurisdictions labeled welcoming or sanctuary.
On what grounds?
Often finding those federal actions to be unconstitutional overreach, violating that anti-commandeering principle.
Even though the administration kept trying?
Yes. The sources note that while the Trump administration faced numerous court losses on various immigration actions, they remained, quote, undeterred in pursuing their agenda.
And didn't the Supreme Court weigh in somehow?
It did. Indirectly, perhaps. In U.S. v. Texas, the court supported the anti-commandeering doctrine. But in context of states suing to compel the federal government to enforce immigration laws more strictly, the court essentially said states can't force the feds to act either. It cuts both ways.
Interesting. So if the federal government can't force states to cooperate using direct orders, what leverage do they actually have?
That's where federal funding comes in. It's a significant political tool.
The power of the purse.
Exactly. Congress controls federal spending, and there's this ongoing debate about whether they can legally tie federal grants, say, for law enforcement to state cooperation with certain federal policies, including immigration enforcement.
And the sources mention past court challenges where attempts to restrict specific federal grants for these sanctuary areas were actually blocked.
That's right. Partly because losing those funds could have such a huge detrimental impact on the operations of larger state departments, potentially coercing them into actions the Constitution doesn't compel them to take.
So the courts seem hesitant to let the federal government use funding as a way to coerce states into doing things they aren't constitutionally required to do.
It's a very complex legal dance, yes, but it absolutely sets the stage for the often stark political battle lines we see drawn on this issue.
And the sources really lay out just how different those lines are. That Pew data is quite revealing.
It really is. For Republicans, the absolute top priority is border security. 91% see it as important, and a huge 72% say it's very important.
72%, that's high.
Extremely. And increasing deportations is also way up there. Important for 79% of Republicans, with nearly half saying very important.
And this is even stronger among conservative Republicans.
Especially among conservative Republicans, yes, compared to other segments of the party.
Okay, and on the Democratic side?
The prioritization is notably different. Border security is seen as important by a smaller percentage, 59%. But crucially, far fewer see it as very important, only 22% compared to that 72% of Republicans.
Big gap.
Huge. Similarly, increasing deportations is a priority for only 39% of Democrats, and a mere 12% consider it very important.
So Democrats generally are focused elsewhere.
As the sources suggest, they tend to focus more on things like inclusive reforms, pathways to legal status, integrating immigrants into society.
That gives us the general party platforms, but it's worth noting, public opinion isn't always a simple party line split.
Absolutely not.
That NPR report, for example, showed public opinion on specific policies, like President Trump's approach to deportations, is actually quite divided.
Yeah, polls showing approval and disapproval numbers hovering pretty close to each other, around the mid-50s percentage range, depending on the poll.
So not a clear mandate either way on that specific tactic.
Right. But what's perhaps more telling from that NPR analysis is that despite that split on individual policies, the Republican Party has consistently polled better on handling the issue of immigration overall since November 2024.
What does that suggest?
It suggests that maybe, even if the public is divided on specific tactics, the overall framing of the issue, or perhaps the perceived competence on the issue, currently favors Republicans.
And adding another layer of complexity, that NPR source also points to an internal debate within the Republican Party itself.
That's right. Some figures, like Representatives Valadao and Gonzalez, they've expressed reservations about targeting undocumented immigrants who don't have criminal records.
Advocating for focusing enforcement primarily
on convicted criminal illegal aliens, as they put it, focusing on public safety threats first.
But that perspective contrasts with others in the party.
It does. Sources like NIJC and NPR highlight a push from figures like Stephen Miller for a much more aggressive, broader enforcement strategy.
Like what?
Including more surprise ICE raids, imposing deportation quotas that would inevitably target a much wider range of undocumented individuals, not just those with serious criminal records.
So not even a single monolithic view within the Republican Party on how enforcement should be prioritized.
Not entirely, no. It shows differing tactical approaches.
And for Democrats, what's their main challenge according to the sources?
It seems to be balancing the calls from their progressive base who want stronger immigrant protections, more welcoming policies, with the political need, as one strategist quoted in NPR put it, for a clear and cogent policy around how you manage the country's borders.
That sounds like a difficult political tightrope to walk.
It is. Trying to address concerns about border management while upholding principles of treating immigrants with dignity and fairness.
And these differing political priorities, these different views, they lead directly to sharply contrasting ideas about the real-world impacts of these policies, right? Welcoming versus stricter enforcement.
Absolutely. The debate over impact is central.
So what are the main arguments presented in the sources regarding those impacts? Let's start with the welcoming side.
Okay. On that side, proponents, drawing on analysis like that from the NIJC, argue that these welcoming policies, think of things like Illinois' Trust Act, which limits state and local law enforcement's ability to detain individuals for IC based only on their immigration status. They argue these policies actually foster greater safety and prosperity.
How does that work?
The idea is, if immigrant communities trust local police, if they aren't constantly afraid that reporting a crime or even interacting with law enforcement for minor issues will lead to their deportation or their family's deportation,
Then they're more likely to cooperate.
exactly. More likely to report crimes, act as witnesses, seek help when needed. And the argument is that this makes everyone safer, not just the immigrant community. It can lead to better crime reporting and resolution overall.
Okay, and what's the counter-argument, the perspective from critics of these policies?
Sources reflecting this view, including some of the discussions found on Reddit, often start from the position that undocumented immigrants are fundamentally lawbreakers, simply by virtue of their immigration status.
So the status itself is the primary issue.
From this perspective, yes. They are often seen as individuals who strain public resources, schools, healthcare, social services, and critically, take jobs that should rightfully go to legal citizens or residents.
And therefore,
This viewpoint argues states should help the federal government enforce immigration law. They should assist in deportations. There's also sometimes an assertion that those who don't apply through legal channels might have criminal histories they're trying to conceal.
there are economic dimensions tangled up in this debate too, aren't there?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Very significant ones. Some sources suggest that restrictive state laws, ones that make it harder for immigrants to live and work, can negatively impact the labor force,
In what way?
particularly in sectors like agriculture, construction, hospitality, industries that have historically relied heavily on immigrant workers. Limiting this labor pool, they argue, can hurt local economies, lead to labor shortages.
And the counterpoint on the economy.
The opposing view, again often voiced in critical perspectives, is that undocumented workers take jobs from legal citizens and potentially depress wages for low-skilled work.
There's also the cost of enforcement itself.
A huge factor. There's the cost associated with deportations. The Cato Institute, according to the NIJC source and timelines, estimated the cost of deporting all undocumented immigrants could be nearly $1 trillion.
Wow. 1 trillion.
It's a staggering figure, and it's often used by opponents of mass enforcement to argue against the practicality and economic wisdom of such actions.
And the NIJC source also brings up critiques about the way enforcement is carried out, doesn't it?
It does, arguing that ICE is increasingly targeting non-criminal individuals, not just those with serious criminal convictions.
Which is a key point for advocates of welcoming policies.
Yes, they believe enforcement should prioritize genuine public safety threats, not just immigration status alone.
There's also mention of exploiting tragic events.
Yes, a particularly powerful and often cited critique mentioned in the NIJC source is the accusation that some administration officials exploit tragic deaths like the death of Laken Riley, or, as the source specifically notes, allegedly attempting to use the death of Emma Schaefer to promote anti-sanctuary agendas.
Even against the wishes of the families involved.
Reportedly, yes, which highlights the deeply emotional and sometimes very controversial nature of this debate and the tactics employed on all sides.
And these tensions, they aren't just theoretical arguments in hearings. They're playing out in very real recent flashpoints.
Absolutely. We saw that controversial June 2025 deployment of National Guard and active duty Marines to protests in Los Angeles.
Right. What was the controversy there?
That action involved deploying federalized troops under Title X authority, meaning they were placed under federal command, not state command.
And this happened without the governor's okay.
Exactly. Without the explicit request or approval of the California governor, which was a major point of contention.
And some administration officials reportedly tied this back to Governor Walz's past actions in Minnesota.
Yes, potentially as a justification for bypassing state authority this time around. Both Governor Newsom of California and Governor Pritzker strongly criticized this federal move as a serious breach of state sovereignty.
And we also can't overlook the rapid pace of executive actions right at the start of the current administration, January 20th, 2025, day one.
A flurry of activity. Measures like declaring an invasion at the border, aiming to restart controversial policies like Remain in Mexico, severely restricting asylum access.
Rolled out very quickly.
Very quickly. And the NIJC source notes that these actions have faced and continue to face significant legal challenges.
But the administration presses on.
Yes, illustrating a strong emphasis on using robust executive authority to push a hardline enforcement agenda, even when it generates conflict with states or hits legal roadblocks in the courts.
So as we pull back now and look at everything we've covered in this deep dive, what's the key takeaway you see emerging from this complex picture?
I think the central insight, really drawn from all these sources, is that the current state of U.S. immigration policy is just fundamentally shaped by this persistent, legally grounded tension.
Between federal enforcement authority and state sovereignty.
Exactly. It's not just a simple policy disagreement. It's a constitutional struggle. It's a political struggle over who has the primary responsibility, who has the authority in immigration matters.
And layered onto that are these vastly different partisan priorities we talked about.
And competing claims about the real-world impacts economic, social, safety.
And understanding these different layers, the legal boundaries like anti-commandeering, the political motivations driving different parties, the conflicting evidence on impacts, it really does help cut through some of the noise, doesn't it?
It helps make sense of why this issue is so incredibly contentious and, frankly, so difficult to resolve.
It's a classic federalism debate, really.
Playing out on a highly charged, deeply personal issue for many. The question isn't just what the policy should be, but who gets to decide it. And how do local priorities square with national goals?
It certainly leaves you with something to consider. As this debate continues to evolve, pushed by events like these committee hearings, challenged constantly in the courts, how will that precise balance of power between the federal government and the states ultimately be defined?
And maybe more importantly, regardless of how that balance shifts, what will the long-term real-world consequences actually be? For communities across the country, for law enforcement, and of course for the individuals navigating this incredibly complex system.